Today we're talking about chalices. Emilzy has recently made a video about war chalices specifically, which will be linked at the end of the video. If you haven't watched that yet, I highly recommend checking that out. He goes a bit more in depth on the numbers for war chalices only. We first address the Chalice of the Oracle as well, and then we'll also look at the Chalice of Healing and the Chalice of Mana. So, about the Chalice of the Oracle. This chalice costs 400 gold, so it's a bit more expensive than the others. It gives you 2 wards whenever you back to base, and then it fills up automatically. And the wards are pretty much just normal wards that last for 3 minutes. So, in reality, the equivalent of that in buying wards would simply be 8 wards until you have the same amount of gold spent. But it's not that simple. What Emilzy explains in his video is how you often have to go back to base in order to get the wards, and how you can only place 2 wards at the same time. So if you were to place some sentry wards as well, you would only be able to place 1 ward and so on. His calculation comes down to you needing roughly 13 minutes to get the value out of the chalice in comparison to just buying normal wards. I think that's actually a very optimistic approach. 12 minutes are only what the time of the wards is, so you need to watch those timers. It also assumes that you have to back ever so often in order to get the wards. Then you have to have the time from base back to where the wards are placed, and then the time from one ward to another. And I think that adds up to much more than a single minute on top of the 12 minutes that the wards last. So especially if you can't go to that place where you want to place the ward right in that moment when the other ward goes down, I think the time is actually much longer. And then you will often have placed sentries and so on. So I'm pretty sure that realistically, to actually get the value out of this item, it will take you roughly 16 to 20 minutes. On the other hand, Polar Bear Mike argues that sometimes the value is different here because you're not always going to wait out for a ward to run out simply because you want to place a ward in a specific place to see what's happening, just for example on a Gold Fury, to spy on the enemy team if they're actually trying to do it right now, or something like that. So there is a bit of a debate on the time to value ratio. But in the end, you can tell that the value is not going to be much lower than 12 minutes for the item to be worth it compared to normal wards, and it's most likely more than that. It's most likely roughly 15 minutes. And even if you were to place 2 more wards after that, you would only get an extra value of 100 gold. And that means that this item is in a very awkward spot, in my opinion at least. You're usually not going to start with a warding chalice into your game, simply because as a support there are certain items that you want before you invest into such a costly item. You want your boots done, you probably want your first aura item done, or CDR item, or whatever you're looking for in your build. But usually there are some core items that you want to have before you invest heavily into something like a 400 gold extra item. Otherwise you're just behind the other support in your build for a very long time until you eventually catch up because you didn't spend as much on wards, which is then, by that point, probably a value that you can pretty much ignore. Even if you were to save 200 gold, this is not that important anymore when we're talking about a point of the game where you have 4 to 5 items, as compared to very, very early in the game where really every bit of gold matters as much as it can. Early snowball and smite is generally a huge problem, and has been a huge problem for a long time, especially important now that you do the lane before you do the camps. And because of that, you don't want to be someone who struggles in this early phase any more than necessary, and that's exactly what the War Chalice is gonna do. So you're planning on getting it a little bit later into the game, and then it's already a debate on how much it's gonna be worth. For example, if you get it around the 10-minute mark, you probably already bought some wards before that you spent gold on. You will still want to buy sentries just to clear out enemy wards and have like absolute vision of a specific place. And all this kind of stuff that really factors in. And by 30 minutes, you're probably already looking for rituals. And the moment you get rituals, you can basically only get sentries and rituals, so you have to get rid of your chalice as well. So the time frame for the warding chalice is extremely short. And the fact that it places 2 normal wards, while not allowing you to place an extra sentry ward, just puts it in a very awkward spot. And while I still do see opportunities to build it sometimes, I would generally argue that unless you're very ahead and you can just splurge out on a 400 gold item, the other chalices are usually a bit more cost efficient as for what they offer and how pricey the consumable for them is and so on. So I would say out of the 3, this is probably the weakest chalice, and there is an opportunity to build it sometimes, but it's very rare as the item has so many downsides. And that brings us to the Chalice of Healing. Now what you have to understand with the Chalice of Healing as well as the Chalice of Mana is that consumables are usually focused around the early to mid game. In late game you're not gonna get much out of health potions, you're usually not buying them anymore, and same with mana potions. So you have to keep in mind that this is something you will sell eventually. In terms of value for money, both of these chalices are actually a little better. They cost 300 gold and they give you 3 potions each time. So basically, if you back once, you already have the value out of this item. As opposed to the Warding Chalice where it takes you 3 times of extra backing after buying the item. The fact that it leaves you with 3 potions is also its biggest downside at the same time, and this is interesting. The reason why this is somewhat bad is because the time where you really want potions, especially in solo lane, is very, very early, before you have anything, before you have any sort of aggression, clear, anything like that, just looking for those early level sustain options. And that's what pots offer you, and by going into a chalice, you limit yourself. Instead of getting 5 potions, as you would usually be able to, or 4 potions, you can only get 3. Depending on how aggressive you play and how much you get bullied out by your enemy, this can be an important difference. But it can also not be, and this is where this choice comes in. Buying this chalice kind of forces you in a specific playstyle where you have to be a little more careful early on, in the very early stages, but as soon as you backed and you know that your enemy is not gonna buy as many health potions as you now have stacks on your consumable, it all of a sudden becomes a lot more valuable because you can now play more aggressive. And that goes especially for hunters. I think hunters are actually, as of now, best suited for the Chalice of Healing. And this is because they usually start with a starter and boots and some pots. Solo laners usually stack up on pots as much as possible, but in the ADC area there's usually not that much early aggression, there's not too much damage coming out, those characters are not built that much for early game, well, except for some outliers like Neith or Anhur. But if you are a character that is only looking for late game and you're against a character that's only looking for late game, you're not gonna have that heavy trades early on. And I often found myself just buying 2 to 3 pots in the first place and then going into lane with some extra gold, whereas with the Chalice you could just get that instead and spend some more gold early on, but save that later down the road. With hunters typically just having death toll, if any kind of sustain at all at this point, you don't really have the lifesteal option to heal yourself up, so you kinda rely on the pots usually, and the Chalice makes that a lot easier because you have a lot more sustain and you can play more aggressive once you backed a few times. So I think for hunters this is often, not always, but often a great option, as long as you can live with getting your boots a little later. But then again, I feel like oftentimes you're gonna back around that time anyways, where you would have that extra gold to what you spend more on Chalice essentially, so it's not a huge difference. It's 150 gold that you have to stay more, so it's something you can survive if you play smart. In solo lane this is a lot harder because in solo lane many characters depend on those early pots in order to get things going, as mentioned, but some characters can get away with it. If you have a character that has a lot of self-sustain, for example, you can get away with it. If you have a character that really doesn't rely so much on any kind of item power curve and doesn't really need boots as fast. For example, say Odin. Odin just does so much without any items. He's not an item dependent character compared to others, that for him it's an option to go into the Chalice and get some items done a little later, and in return just have this Chalice out of the way and then eventually get the benefits from not having to buy pots. So essentially the characters you're looking for with these Chalices are either not item dependent or very late game, so that you know you're not going to look for any aggression early anyways. On the mana Chalice specifically, a few words regarding who can use this best. I think this is especially good for self-healers. Once again, Hercules for example is a great example, Sobek as well, and mana intense gods. So not only those two but also Cabrakan. Anyone who can sustain themselves or just needs a ton of mana in lane, even until mid-game, can make good use of the Chalice of Mana. A lot of it really comes down to your playstyle more than the general efficiency of this item. They can be good, but they can also be bad depending on how you play and how you use them, and how the power curve of your god is. For other roles, I would usually recommend neither of them. In the mid lane, you usually want to look for an early power spike via items, so you can't really spend that much on Chalices. In the jungle, you're kind of looking for early items as well. Also, if you buy Bombas and a starter, you won't even have the gold left to do this. Supports usually have good means of sustaining in lanes without taking too much damage, so they're not really dependent on the other chalices that much. And I don't think they really need the mana chalice, especially with watchers already giving you mana as well. Whereas other roles are usually very item dependent and often don't have enough room or don't make enough use of the Chalice of the Oracle in general for it to be worth it. Outliers exist, but especially with rituals being in the game and you having to get rid of the chalices eventually if you still want to get sentry wards, you kinda have to consider when the value is there and when it's simply not. I personally would prefer to see the Chalice of the Oracle to be used for sentries instead at maybe a higher price, because I just think that's something that would be worth it throughout the whole game and as such gets more value, but it's still a big investment, but that's just me. With that, I hope this was informative and give you a bit more of an insight into how to use these chalices and when to use them. Thank you guys for watching, hope to see you all for the next one tomorrow. SLOTH, out.